Hey guys, so this is the intro video to today's class, Intro to Acrylics. So we're going to cover a number of different techniques today for using acrylics, but first a little bit about the medium. So acrylics are a fast drying sort of plastic. They are similar to oil paints in that they're opaque, but instead of blending smoothly and giving you a long time to work like oil paints, they dry quite quickly. That means they're good for certain things and not so great for others. So they're good if you like really graphic, vibrant works with sharp, delineated lines. They're not the ideal medium if you're really doing a lot of work in blending and graduated curves and things with really smooth, blended transitions. Although these things are possible with acrylics, they're just a little bit harder to work with. But many people do work with acrylics for a wide range of different art styles simply because they don't require fumes like toxic mediums to mix with like you do with oil paints. They're water soluble, so they're a little bit safer to use around the house. Just one note, if you're using these at home, do not dump your acrylic water down the sink because it will dry in your sink and basically clog the pipes. So work on a palette. That being said, let's start with how to use a palette knife. The second thing you should know how to use when using acrylics is a palette knife. So you want to mix with this and not your brush. That's because the more spread out these become, the quicker they dry. So we want to keep everything in a smooth little pile so that our paint doesn't dry up. So for instance, here I'm going to mix together a little bit of light blue. I pick up the light blue, place it down here, pick up the white, place it down here. Just a note, buy 3 times the white when you're buying acrylics because you're going to go through a lot of it since we use white to make things lighter. And then I'm just picking up the paint and smashing it down on the page, keeping it as much in a tidy little pile as I can. So I'm not spreading it all over the page. I'm keeping it really nice in this little pile. Okay, and then you'll want to have some paper towels on hand to wipe your brush off in between. So let's get started. We're going to start with glazing just because I need this to dry a bit. Now you can use acrylics a little bit like a watercolor. So with this technique, let's take a little bit of red and we're going to add some water to it. And now we're just going to put a wash of this down on the page and then we're going to leave it alone for a little bit. If you want, you can add little bits of washes of different colors. I'm going to add in some yellow here, just like I would with a watercolor, but if you want to test this out, just no stress. You can just put down a swatch of a single color. And we'll come back to this. This is drying super quickly. Also a note, this paper I'm using is hot pressed watercolor paper. So it'll be called acrylic paper, but you can use canvas, you can use cardboard, you can use plywood, you can use pretty much anything as a base for acrylics other than plain cartridge paper because it's too thin. Because acrylics create their own ground. They're plastic, so we put this on, it dries, and we have a pretty much waterproof surface to do further layers on. So they're very forgiving. Okay, so next let's do some blending. So blending is when you mix 2 colors together into the wet paint. So I'm just going to show you what this looks like here, 2 different ways of doing blending. Here I'm going to pick up some blue, put that on the top, and put some of this white on the bottom. Then I'm just going to brush from the top into the white, and you'll see that this starts to blend together. So I can move back over it. Until this is all blended together, and add in a little bit more blue while it's still wet to try to make it a little bit darker at the top. Now, as you can see, this is a little fiddly, and I end up adding more and more paint as I try to create a gradient. It can be done, but because this paint is drying so quickly, this isn't working quite as well as it would if I was using a slower drying medium such as oil paints. So It's doable. Many people work like this. The one thing you don't want to do is add too much water to your brush to try to get it to blend. You can add a little bit of water, but if you add too much water, it'll start picking up the paint and leaving these really annoying little streaks in it. So you want to keep your brush fairly dry when you're using white to lighten your paint. But let's look at another way we can blend the paint. And this is simply where I use my palette knife beforehand to mix together several different colors. So to make this interesting, I'm going to make a purple by mixing blue and red. Today we're only going to use 3 colors because I want to make you kind of force you guys to learn color theory a bit, so learn a little bit about color mixing. I'm going to mix up some of this purplish color. And then I'm going to take half of this color and mix it with half of this blue color. See, I'm still keeping everything in a nice little pile here. It's really easy to contaminate acrylics, so in between mixing, make sure to wipe your palette knife off. And then I'm going to mix in a lighter shade over here. One thing I can do to make this blend a little bit easier, so I'm going to wet the paper ever so slightly. Not a lot, or it'll change this, which is opaque blending, to something more like glazing, which we don't want for this particular demonstration. And now, and you can pick the colors up with your brush, but I'm just going to do this with a palette knife because I don't want my brush to get really dirty and I want to do this quickly. I'm picking up some purple, then the next color down, then the next color down, then the next color down, and quickly, making sure my brush is fairly dry, blending the 2 sides over. And so long as I'm careful keeping my brush fairly clean, this kind of creates an easier way, a more kind of controlled way of blending your paints. Now I'm just going to make a lighter blue to taper off down the end. One thing you might want to get, and we'll just see if this works here, but is a dry brush. If you have a makeup brush or a dry soft brush, I can't quite see where I've put my dry brush, so I'm just going to use this brush here. But you can also blend your colors by quickly going over the top of them while they're kind of semi-dry and almost airbrushing them together. So I'm not pressing down on the page, I'm just feathering this brush over this combination to get them to blend a bit more. Bear in mind that you can only do this kind of one area at a time because the paint does dry quite quickly. Okay, so dry on dry, we're just going to do a block of this color here and wait for it to dry. This is where we're using the acrylics almost neat, so we haven't added really much water at all to them. And then for this section here, we're going to wet down the page. And then we're going to add water to our acrylic. You can add it to the same mix. To do a wet layer, you can see how that's blending. And now let's try adding some red to that layer. So you can see the red is kind of bleeding out in this wet layer. So you might find interesting techniques using this technique. But you'll notice if you sort of play around with your brush that when you apply the color on wet paint, it starts to pick up the characteristics of the color underneath it. So it's a little bit less controlled. Now glazing is where we let thin layers dry in between each other. So let's take a little bit of that purple that we made and add some more water to it. And you'll see you can see the underlying color underneath the areas you've done before. So glazing is this technique where you can get these transparent layers. And now I'm going to just quickly use a hairdryer, so this is going to be no noise. Okay, and I want you guys to test two things because this is a problem that that people encounter when they start using acrylic. So first we're going to do it the wrong way, just so you can kind of understand why it's the wrong way. We're going to get some white and we're going to add some water to it. And on dry, we're going to put down a little layer of this white. I mean, I say wrong, it's not wrong, but generally this isn't the effect that people are going for. So you can start to look at the paint and notice that this wet paint, first of all, it's not particularly white, and secondly, it's eating away at the layer underneath it. So your texture is changing. So if you're, really focusing and trying to make a amazing painting and you think you're making things white, but you've added too much water to your brush, you can easily get into a conundrum where you have water eating away your paint and you're losing all those lovely layers that you've done. Let's try that again, but not adding any water to our paint. You want to really thoroughly coat your brush, and there we go. So see, this is opaque. And this, I find this is a more ideal way to layer your paint. You want to make sure that each thickness of paint kind of matches the one before it. Some people like to layer their acrylics like in really thin layers to create that effect. I don't love that effect because I feel like, it just shows too many brush strokes and you might as well use oils if you're going to be doing that, but you can kind of taper and thin the paint as you move away. You can use the base layer to create some of the texture of the layer above. Okay, and let me get my other sheet of paper. Impasto. So impasto is where we use our brush, not our brush, our palette knife, or any object really. You could even use a brush for this, but where we leave the paint quite thick. So let's mix together a green, okay, and because we need to wait for this to dry, let's use up some of our colors here. Let's use a nice bright blue and put it down here. So we're just doing kind of a semi-thin wash of this here. And we're just doing that because we need to let it dry. Let me see if we need to do that anywhere else. Nope. Okay, we're just gonna leave that dry. Don't worry about that for now. Now impasto, let's add a tiny bit of red to that green to make it a bit more natural. Hold on. And I'm just going to use the side of my palette knife to make a few lines. And even add some down here. I'm going to wipe this off. And I am going to mix together some white and yellow. Mix together a good amount of this. I'm just going to use a nice big chunk of my paint. And you can use any color you want. With impasto, you don't want whatever implement you're using to touch the paper. So, like basically, it's like, imagine you're spreading cheese on a piece of bread. You're not going to smash the knife into the bread. You're going to leave a little bit of space in between the cheese and the bread. And that's essentially what we're doing here. We're just letting the paint sit on the page and not pressing down. And impasto, it doesn't mean you have to do it with a palette knife. You could do it with your brush even, but it's just a way of using very thick paint in a sculptural form. So I'm going to turn these into little flowers to the best of my ability. This will only work with heavy body acrylics. So the acrylics I'm using right now, I mean, a lot of acrylics are heavy body acrylics, but this won't work very well if you're using something called acrylic gouache. So check your acrylics. If you're using more of an acrylic gouache, this isn't going to work quite as well. All right, and now sponging. So let's think of, well, let's do some clouds again. So sponging is when we use a sponge to blend our paint, of course. So let's put down a sky. You can do this with a dry or wet sponge on dry or wet paint. It'll create a range of different effects. So we won't do like every single effect today, but just to get a sense. So we're going to wet our little sponge. And I'm getting a little bit more white. And now I'm going to pick up some of the white with my sponge and just dab it over the wet paint. You can use this to create sort of like cloudy type things. You can use it to create foliage if you're using a lighter color underneath. So, but this is one of the ways that you can blend your paints. Just remember that in order to make the paint opaque, we need to allow our layers to dry. So as much as I want to make that lighter right now, I know I have to let it dry. Okay, I'm going to clean this sponge now. Just going to use that hairdryer again, so sorry in advance for the noise. And now I can come in with a more opaque layer of white paint. Create little highlights on these clouds. I don't want to get carried away, but this is a little bit addictive, the sponging technique. Okay, finally, let's do a hog's brush and sgraffito. So a hog's bristle brush is a brush used in oil painting and acrylics. Basically, it has thicker bristles than like a watercolor brush that are used to pick up the pigment and smash it into the canvas. So this isn't ideal for working on something like smooth paper. This is better if you're working on canvas and building up sort of thinner layers. But it has its use on paper like this as well. And that's because it can add texture. One way it can add texture is if you take your brush, hold it vertically over your paint, maybe just dip the tip of it into some water. This is called dry brushing. You can create grass effects with this, but we'll go over that a little bit more next week. In landscapes, you can also create foliage, but that's another thing that we'll do more of in landscapes. But you can use it to do kind of a background texture. So I'm just gonna dab the remainder of this green. I'm going to mix up a little bit more green. Hold on, more green. Dab, 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 dab some blue up here, and dab some yellow down here. And let's dip this brush in water and pull our paint down so you can see different layers of paint coming through as texture here. And this might be nice for a jungle background or for, leaves reflected in water, or all sorts of things that you could use this for. I'm gonna let this dry and then do sort of a little bit of bamboo on top of it. But in the meantime, let's do sgraffito. So this has dried. This needs to be totally dry. So using either a toothpick or, in this case, our palette knives. This technique is where we're just going to pick the paint up. Well, anyway, I'll show you. It's easier that way. So since I have red remaining, I'm going to put down a layer of red. Quickly, while this is wet, I can lift out so that the color below is revealed. super fun. All right, so now I'll just make a light green for my little bamboo forest. I'm gonna make some light green by adding white to the green I had and a little bit of yellow. And I'll make another one with a little bit more yellow, and then I'll make another one with a little bit more of the blue, just using up all of my paint here. All right, I'm sorry, I'm gonna use a hairdryer. And now I'm gonna grab top of a paint stirrer. You can use a piece of cardboard for this. I'm going to dip it in water, and I'm going to place different tones of green from side to side on this. I want a more intense green, but I don't want to have to bring, anyway. Yeah, just place the green side by side like this. Maybe some white to add a little bit more contrast. And I'm gonna place it straight on the page like this and go in a little half circle up, down. That's a bit too thick. Up, down, up, down, up, down. You know, I'm gonna try this with cardboard. Let me just get a little bit of cardboard. Well, this last ones are looking a little bit more like bamboo, so it's not like a great bamboo forest, but it's yet another fun technique that we can use our acrylics for. Just gonna do this. So I'll leave it there and we'll move on to the presentation. So I hope this was helpful, but just to be clear, there's not a huge right or wrong way to use acrylics. I mean, you can use a bunch of combinations of different styles. Don't panic about, okay, am I using this correct? Am I mixing it with enough water? It's not about how much water you mix with it. It's just about if you're using one sort of layer, you want to be in control of how dry the paint is so it doesn't eat away at the layers underneath it. So some people like to build up, you know, semi-transparent layers. Some people like to build up completely opaque layers. It's entirely up to you, but I'd recommend using watercolors if you like the transparent effects a bit more, and experimenting with oils if you're more into the blending effects. I think acrylics are best for layering techniques like we'll do in the demonstration. Okay, well, thanks for watching. Okay, bye.